All right, well, welcome everyone to the Gulf Coast Prairie Landscape Conservation Cooperative Lunchtime Webinar Series for May 2016. We are recording the webinar today. Before we begin, I remind everyone listening to please mute your phones during the presentation. There will be time that we encourage you to ask questions after the presentation. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide some additional context to landscape conservation design efforts across the Southeast. Today we are joined by Todd Jones-Farrand, Science Coordinator for the Gulf Coast Plains and Ozarks LCC. Todd works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and is stationed at the University of Missouri in Columbia. In just a moment, he will talk to us about the GCPO LCC's draft conservation blueprint, focusing on the process and conservation priorities identified by the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC, which lies to the east and shares a border with the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC. This webinar is of interest to the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC because the GCPO draft conservation blueprint will ultimately be stitched together with landscape design of the GCP and ecologically connected network. Todd has served as a science coordinator for the GCPO LCC for just over a year. Prior to that, he served as a science coordinator for the Central Hardwoods Joint Venture for 5 years. In both positions, he has maintained a focus on restoration of natural communities as a primary mechanism for achieving conservation objectives. When not at work, he's into stringed instruments, tattoos, whiskey, and playing giant robot with his 2-year-old son. So without further ado, Todd, we welcome you. You have control of the WebEx, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Ben, for that introduction. And we will share my screen here and get started. All right, can you see that just fine?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about our blueprint for the GCPO, as Ben said. And so I'll start off with a little overview of the GCPO, keep that very brief, about 3 slides. Then I'll spend most of my time talking about the blueprint as we are envisioning it now. This is an ongoing iterative process, and so things are rapidly changing, but this is the way we see it now. And talk about some opportunities for inputs and next steps, because we are in the midst of this process, and there's still a lot of opportunity to steer the ship. So GCPO, this is our boundary. We're about 180 million acres. We are the LCC to your east, and we subdivide our geography into 5 sub-geographies: the Ozarks of Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, the West Gulf Coastal Plain of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana, as well as the Mississippi Alluvial Valley and the Gulf Coast are kind of our borders with your all's region. Like your LCC, we are a self-directed, non-regulatory partnership, and you see the agencies that are on our steering committee, and we share a number of those agencies, including Fish and Wildlife Service, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation. So we have a technical team that is kind of composed of folks who represent different resources listed here in the columns for each one of the 5 sub-geographies and major watersheds that intersect those sub-geographies. So we try to populate our technical team with folks who represent a balance of scientists versus managers, federal folks versus state folks and NGOs. This is the current. Actually, this one is out of date. We have filled the 2 plant positions that are vacant, and it looks like we'll get the mammals position filled as well. Like the GCP, we put all of our data sets and try and gather some of our partners' data sets and put them on a conservation planning atlas. This is our portal, and I'll be referencing this LCC blueprint gallery here in a little bit. So that's the overview of the GCPO. Let's get into the blueprint. And by blueprint, what we're talking about there is for the Fish and Wildlife Service folks, landscape conservation design. But we tend to use blueprint because it's a more ecumenical term. And to kind of explain the blueprint to folks, this is my approach, and you can see the influence of my 2-year-old son on this. To sustain these natural resources, the best available science indicates that we need this many more acres of these habitat systems in these places in this condition. And those are the kinds of questions we're trying to answer. How much more, which habitat systems, where on the landscape, and what kind of condition do we want to support those natural resources. So in trying to develop the blueprint, we recognized that this was going to be an iterative process, that it was a social process as well as a technical process, and we needed some criteria by which to guide our development. And so those criteria are listed here. First and foremost, we wanted to be transparent, replicable, and defensible. That's kind of our definition of science. And we, as you will see here in a little bit, we put a lot of emphasis on the transparency part. We wanted something that was holistic and comprehensive. We wanted to do aquatics as well as terrestrial. We wanted to hit all the major habitat systems in the GCPO. And we wanted an approach that was consistent as possible across those 5 subgeographies. They're very different in terms of ecological makeup, but we wanted a process that was, you know, kind of allowed us to work across those differences. And kind of another, above all, kind of driving force of this is we wanted something that would allow us to link existing efforts and kind of be able to kind of say, what is the cumulative effect of a bunch of local actions at the regional scale? So right now what we're doing is LCC-wide, but we think that we're providing a framework that we can then step this down to more local scales if we're going to work, say, a refuge landscape conservation design or some more local landscape. So as I said before, we see this as an iterative social process as much as a technical process. And the way this works is that LCC staff do most of the work. We take that to our adaptation science management team and work iteratively with them. We have invited some additional folks into that, which includes refuge I&M folks, state wildlife action plan leaders, to try and help us get a more holistic view of those habitat systems. And then once we thought we had some products that were worth sharing and getting some input on, we've taken those out to the broader conservation community. We just wrapped up a series of 7 in-person workshops plus several smaller side meetings with folks to try and get that input from the conservation community. And right now, all of our maps are available on the CPA, and we have an open comment period asking folks to go take a look and tell us what they think of the maps, how useful they are, where we're getting it right, where we're getting it wrong, those kinds of things. So on the technical side, the blueprint process, what we're trying to do is get from our partnership vision to a strategic framework where we can work collaboratively, more effectively, and address future changes. So how do we get there? Well, there's a number of steps we need to take, and this is the rapid prototyping of products. We need to answer these questions about how much we want, how much do we have, how much more do we need, where can we get that, where are the best places to work together towards those goals, and then how do we monitor our effectiveness. So we're working around the outside of this wheel, and so far we've gotten to the point where we've ranked places for action right now, and the next step, one of the next steps will be developing focal landscapes. You see the back arrows here. This is part of that iterative process. As we're taking steps through this, we're finding that we didn't do a real good job of making decisions or answering questions at an earlier step, and so there's some feedback loops that are figuring into this, and that's part of the rapid prototyping process, is to help us figure out what things are the most important to be focused on. So starting with the partnership vision, this is our vision and mission statement. and it talks about, you know, sustaining landscapes and that kind of stuff. We generally boil all this text down to what you see on the title of the slide. We aim to define, design, and deliver landscapes capable of sustaining desired natural and cultural resources. And so we're spending a lot of time as the LCC staff and technical team on that define and design part. But everything that we need, that we're doing, really needs to support delivery of conservation on those landscapes. And if we're not doing that, then we're missing the boat. So we have a general statement about wanting sustainable landscapes, but we need to be more specific about that. And so how much do we want? What are our goals and objectives? Our vision and mission statement says natural and cultural resources. At this point, we've only dealt with the natural resources. The cultural side has yet to be fleshed out, and that's something that we may be doing in concert with your LCC as we move forward over the next year and with other LCCs in the Southeast. Our science agenda defines those natural resources. We're using broadly defined habitat types similar to what you all are using, and I'll go into that in a moment. And we've linked a number of diverse taxa species to those habitat systems and the desired conditions therein. So this is a small snippet of the broadly defined habitats hierarchy table that the Region 4 of the Fish and Wildlife Service put together. And so I'll zoom in on this to make a couple of comments. First of all, this smaller red box on the forested wetlands, when we're doing stuff on the terrestrial side, this is where we're working. It's on the broadly defined habitat. But it's crosswalked to that NatureServe system names that you see in the right-hand column, so what our states are working on can be easily linked up to what we're working on. The long rectangle there on the freshwater aquatic, NatureServe doesn't have aquatic classes, so we're using the classes as defined by the refuge system. Freshwater aquatic is way too vague, so we're over here working on the 3 systems that are included in that box. So all in all, we have 9 habitat systems, and starting in the top left, we have main stem big rivers. Next to that is low gradient streams of the coastal plain. Next to that is high gradient streams of the uplands of the Ouachitas and Ozarks. Then in the middle row, we have forested wetlands, which includes bottomland hardwoods, swamps, riparian areas, open pine, upland hardwood forests and woodlands, and grasslands. And then in the bottom row, we have 2 coastal systems that we're working on, beaches and dunes and tidal marsh. And so for comparison, here in the middle, we have the list of habitat systems that the GCP is working on, and there's some pretty close one-to-one relationships between our forested wetlands and your floodplain forests, swamps, and riparian systems, as well as our grasslands and your tall grass prairie. The other linkages there in red, there's some overlap, there's some discrepancies there between. For example, on tidal wetlands, we're only dealing with tidal marsh. Your tidal wetlands would also include mangroves, and we don't have any in our region. But there's a lot of kind of overlap here and opportunity for us to be informing each other's work on these habitat systems. So in our science agenda for each one of our habitat systems, we define the desired ecological state, the statement here in italics, but we can't map that or assess that condition without getting a little more specific. So in the table on the left, you see a number of configuration and condition metrics that we have essentially getting more specific about what we mean about what it is we want for this system. On the right is the table of species that are linked to those systems, and so if there is an X in the box, that means that that species needs that habitat requirement. So in one way, this is using the species to justify why we need understory density. We need it because Swainson's warbler, Kentucky warbler, and hooded warbler need that habitat factor. But it's also kind of a hypothetical habitat relationships model that we will be using later on. Here is the similar slide for big rivers, and I want you to notice two things about this. One is that there are no numbers in the table on the left. We're much more vague about what kind of habitat conditions we want. We want temperature below a critical threshold, but we never defined what it was, what that critical threshold was. And in the table on the right, we have much fewer species, and not all the boxes have an X in them. So we still have a lot of work to do. I think we've gone a lot farther down the road with terrestrial systems than we have with aquatics, and we'll be spending quite a bit of time in the next year or two shoring up that aquatics part. So after we defined kind of our goals and objectives, how much we want, the next step was to do a baseline assessment of how much we have. And so essentially we're taking these statements of what kind of conditions we want in the landscape, we're going out and we're finding data sets to map those. And here you see some slider bars giving us a kind of a qualitative assessment of how good the data set is for mapping that particular metric. And so we have some good things. You know, patch size is fairly easy to do. Basal areas is, we got some good data on that. Overstory canes and vines, there's really not a data set that can assess that. But this gives us an idea of how well we can map all of these and where our science needs are. In some cases, these are science needs that we'll put out for an RFP and ask somebody to develop them. In other cases, we'll develop them ourselves. And we have developed 3 products on the aquatic side that could be useful for you all in your planning approaches. And on the left, we have the Inundation Frequency Map, and so this is a 30-year stack of Landsat imagery where we've classified water, and essentially the index is the frequency at which that pixel has been classified as water. So this gives us an idea of flooding extents. We have used that map to create the map in the middle, which is an index of connectedness between the floodplain and the main stem of the river. So as you get to warmer, darker colors there, you're getting farther away from the main stem and less frequent flooding. This kind of analysis has been important for looking at alligator gar spawning habitat and similar species like that. And then on the far right, we have taken some work that done by the Corps of Engineers and tried to do a rapid expansion of that to where we're identifying secondary channels on these main stem big rivers. So we've gone through this process for all 9 of our habitat types, and we're finishing up a couple of them right now. But we needed a way to combine these together, these individual metric assessments, to see, you know, how much of this desired ecological state do we actually have. And so we're using an analogy here from cooking, that we have a bunch of ingredients and we want to bake a cake. What's the recipe that we need? And so we turned, for transparency reasons, we've turned to a simple decision tree kind of an approach. So this is a decision tree for apostrophes. When do you use an apostrophe? You start up here at the top, ask a question, and then depending on your answers, the next questions that follow, you either end up in a black circle where yes, you use an apostrophe, or a red circle where no, you don't. And we're not trying to be that prescriptive, but do conservation here, don't do it there. But it's more of a relative kind of thing. These places are better than these places for these reasons. But we're using this kind of an approach. Recently, I saw a much simpler version of the decision tree, and thanks to Renee Colini for putting this out there. It's does it move, and if it does and it shouldn't, duct tape is the answer. And I just think that's fantastic. I'm going to start using this one instead. But essentially, we apply this simple decision tree kind of an approach to our ingredients to build the cake, essentially to build an index of ecological integrity. So over here in the blue squares, we're looking to see if we don't have forested wetlands, do we have the potential? And if we do, then we give that a value of 1. if we do have forested wetlands, then we go up here to the red boxes and we assess those landscape level condition metrics. Then once we've assessed those, we step down to the site level condition metrics here in the orange box. And the font is black if we have a data set we think we can use for that metric. It is blue if we don't have a data set to assess that metric. And so those kind of serve as placeholders. But essentially, you walk through these questions and you end up with a score between 0 and 25. 0 is not habitat. 1 is potential habitat. 2 through 25 is some relative index of quality. And so you get a 25 if all the metrics we're looking for are available at that location. And as you go down the scale towards the 2 and 7, you're getting into more and more fragmented landscapes, more and more cost and effort to get habitats up to that 25. And so when you apply that to that kind of decision approach to the landscape, you get a map that looks like this, where you see there's almost no purple. It's not visible at this scale because there's very few locations that have every metric that we're looking for according to our data sets. But there's a lot that's in that enhance 1 category, that kind of teal color, which means the patches are big, the landscape's mostly forested, and some or most of the local site conditions that we're looking for are available in those areas. And so this gives us kind of our index of ecological integrity for forested wetlands. Going through that process gave us some feedback that we didn't do such a great job defining goals and objectives, and we've started the process actually now of refining our science agenda to go back and assess some of those questions, like what do we do with canes and vines. So the next step we took was ranking of places for action, and here we're moving from kind of the planning, defining stage to the designing stage, and here was mostly about curating additional information for making decisions. So what are the other things we want to consider, not just ecological condition, when we want to make a decision about where to go to work? So we looked at our own Ozark Highlands pilot project, as well as what state swaps had done, what a couple of the joint ventures had done in terms of identifying priority areas. And our team picked out 4 things they wanted to look at: current habitat condition, impediments and threats, biodiversity or some kind of species measure, and then what our partners were doing, what our partners were interested in doing. So we have these 4 areas and we want to turn them into a blueprint. How do we do that? Well, first off, we had to come up with what was the data input for those 4 different things. And we've gone back and forth in several iterations, but now we have maps for different types of risks, species maps for each one of the habitat systems based either off GAP or NatureServe, and then our partner priority areas down here, we have separate maps for terrestrial and aquatic. But how do we combine those together to draft a blueprint? We went back to this decision tree analysis for the transparency of it. And essentially what we do is we take this condition index, we move those boxes to the top, and we apply the other data sets, the risk, species, and collaboration, as modifiers to tell us where do we need to maintain habitat, where could we protect habitat in the orange and yellow, or where do we need to restore habitat in the greens and blues. So you work depending on what index condition score you get, where you fall, you work through here, you answer questions, and you end up in one of these priority classes. Then we apply that to the map, and we get a map that looks like this. So the darkest red are places that we own that are in high quality condition, and we want to maintain that. Those are the nodes to our network of lands and waters. The oranges are places that are high quality, but they're insecure going into the future, and they're at risk of landscape change. The yellow are high quality. They're insecure, in fact, in that they're not currently protected, but the risk of change is low. And so we have a relative prioritization there where we might want to go protect land first. And then all of the greens and blues are prairies that we could we could do restoration. One of the main things that came out of our workshops is that having all three of these on one map is not as useful as if we split them out into three different maps. And so right now we're kind of working through the process of how do we map maintenance or management separate from protection, separate from restoration, and then how do you use those three pieces together to develop the blueprint. So to give you kind of a more zoomed in example of the blueprint, I'll show you an example here from forested wetlands. Here we're using potential maps from a number of different partners and stitch those together. The risk is about urbanization, but also about water availability into the future and about marsh migration on the coast. So where are bottomland hardwoods on the coast going to be inundated by sea level rise and potentially converted to marsh instead of bottomland hardwoods? And so here's an example from East Texas. You see there's a lot of good stuff on the Neches River, some okay stuff on the Sabine. The Red River looks pretty bad. It's mostly been converted to agricultural. A similar example for streams. Here we're looking at the criteria for medium and low gradient streams. We used a NIFHAP disturbance index to look at these coastal plain streams because we didn't have any kind of watershed level metrics here in the configuration. So we looked at that disturbance index as something that's potentially useful. Here, again, risk is about urbanization, water availability, and marsh migration. And then we end up with a map like this. There's a lot of these coastal streams that look pretty good according to our assessment criteria. And so there's lots of yellows, but there's a lot of greens and blues in there as well, the things that need to be worked on for one reason or another. And because we have this set up in kind of decision tree formats, you can go to any given stream segment or any given pixel on the forested wetlands map, and you can kind of trace back why it got the score that it got. And we think that's one of the advantages of our approach, and that's been borne out through the workshops. Folks liked the transparency of that approach. So that's kind of the blueprint as it stands now. Like I said, it's under development and it's changing all the time, but we expect to have version 1.0 done here sometime this summer. So some opportunities for inputs and next steps that we're doing. Right now, our Blueprint 1.0 gallery has all the maps for all 9 systems and some documentation in there, so you can go in and kind of dig into the maps and give us some feedback, comment online on the maps, and that review period is open now. The table to the right here is a comparison between what our map says with conservation opportunity areas in Missouri's State Wildlife Action Plan. So we are sitting down with some states and talking about, is this stuff useful for helping you implement your blueprint or implement your State Wildlife Action Plan? And all of these workshops and these side meetings are, again, feeding back into how do we better do the baseline assessment, how do we better state our goals and objectives. One of our next steps is prioritization. Here we're getting to identifying focal landscapes for the LCC, and essentially the idea here is that we look for those maintenance areas. How much do we have currently? The rest of the blueprint maps, action maps for where can we get more, and we're going to filter that through species objectives to define, okay, what are some focal areas on the landscape that are large enough to meet the needs of those objectives and provide us places where we can, you know, attack that way of working challenge of collaborative conservation. How do we work together across agency and state lines? How do we develop cooperative monitoring and improve the science that goes into the blueprint planning process and those kinds of things? These focal landscapes are really going to become kind of testing grounds for some of these ideas. Another step we need to take is monitoring and evaluation, and we're just starting to think about this step. Essentially, we want to devise monitoring in a way that allows us to assess if we're getting to goal or not, how effective we're being. And the blueprint maps and the condition index, the way we have them set up now, can give us some information about landscape change over time, but we need to add the species elements in there as well. All of this is working towards a strategic framework for collaborative conservation. And what we're trying to do is develop a set of decision support tools that can be linked together and used in a kind of a proactive decision-making framework where we have objectives down the left column here, the species that we're interested in, time, cost, ecological goods and services could fit in there as well as an objective. And then we can look at different portfolios. You know, what are we doing in Alabama, East Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri as far as pine habitat, and how does that add up to something for pine species? And so this is going to be the framework by which we try and link those local actions to the regional outcomes. So that's kind of all the next steps. I do want to say one thing about Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. So there's a number of, all the LCCs in the South are kind of going through this process, and we're all doing it differently. But there's some commonalities in terms of, like I showed, commonalities in terms of habitats among our LCCs. And I think as we're moving forward, we're going to try and develop this blueprint for the whole Southeast, and this October we're all going to bring something and put it on the table. I think there's going to be lots of commonalities, especially if we can get down to a habitat system by habitat system approach. So we'll probably take our condition indices and our focal areas as the kind of things we submit to CCAS when we get there as kind of our first cut of, this is what we've done, compare that to our neighbors and look for overlap and synergies between those data sets. So with that, I'll leave you with some take-home points. This process that we're going through now, we're pushing through it, kind of rapid prototyping a process, but we're trying to get as much input from the broader community as we can on the utility of what we're doing. And pretty much everything we're doing is based on those habitat systems and our assessments of ecological integrity. But what we're trying to do is support decision-making either by curating available data or in some cases developing data so that we can eventually link it together into that strategic framework for proactive conservation. This is, as I said a couple of times now, very much a work in progress, and we'll be looking to our neighbor LCCs for ideas on how we can improve this, how we can make it better. So if you have some ideas about that and want to get in touch with me or want to see any more detail on how to review our products or what went into them, my email address is there. It's david_jones-farrand@fws.gov. And with that, thank you for your time. I'd be happy to entertain any questions if there are some.
I'm sorry, I think I was on mute. Todd, this is Ben. Let me try to gather my thought here. I really like how very transparent and sort of how well developed the blueprint is, all the way from identifying the broadly defined habitats and walking those through the sort of the conditions and the indexes for all the different configuration and understory and all those things. And the way it's documented is very easy to digest. So thanks for that. I have two questions. One's kind of a softball question. The other one's a bit difficult. So I'll ask you the softball question first. And so can you walk us through the process used to determine the amount for each broadly defined habitat that's married to these baseline assessments?
Well, you know, Ben, you would think that was a softball question, but it's really not. When the science agenda was put together, the technical team was separated into breakout groups by region, and we tackled a couple of habitat systems for each region, and the amount goals came out of that expert opinion kind of forum. at this point, so for example, for forested wetlands, our current amount is 3.7 million acres, but that came out of discussions about forested wetlands in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. It's not a GCPO-wide number. And so we have to go back and kind of reassess that number. Unfortunately, documentation for where those amount numbers came from is missing in most cases. So we have to do some work to kind of tidy that up too, and document where that number came from and why. I think what we'll do moving forward is, to our best ability, gather existing plans, kind of add up their plans for how much they want, compare that to species needs, what we think individual species in those habitat systems need, and and then take, whose number's the biggest, and that'll be our goal overall. We will likely set up those goals by each one of the 5 subgeographies, but that's a process that we haven't started down yet. So the numbers we have now are just considered draft.
Okay. Well, thanks for the honest answer on that. I know that coming up with those numbers can be very difficult, and especially when you're looking at, separate different regions of the geography and discussions about habitats in those. That at some point you have to come up with a number, but also the process for doing that is kind of tedious and in some cases, and I guess for you all, kind of unknown. So the harder question I wanted to ask, and then someone else can ask a question, is, it's absolutely imperative to link design efforts to conservation delivery actions, right? Otherwise, as you say, we're missing the boat. So sort of why are we even going through this if no one's going to use it? So can you talk about the translational aspects of the blueprints, or how the results from the blueprint will inform delivery by GCPO partners, and are there firm commitments from partners to use the blueprint to inform decision-making for conservation delivery actions?
Okay, so that's one of the reasons we went to trying to map the habitat actions of restoration, management, and protection or conservation. And it's one of the reasons, after going through the workshops, we're going to split those maps out and have separate maps for each one of those actions, because it seems to be what the partners are asking for. For example, ES offices are getting mitigation funds. They would like a map of, where's the highest priority to conserve. There will have to be some, allowances for opportunity, but they want to have that individual piece out as its own map to use as a tool. And so we're trying to do some response to partners based on that. We're also getting some feedback that in our current version, things are weighted towards public lands or being near public lands, and folks wanted to de-emphasize that. They want to really focus on private lands more. So we're trying to adjust the products that we're putting out relative to the needs that folks are being asked for, that folks are asking for. So that's part of that translational stuff. That is also a work in progress. So at this point, we've only been working on this for a year. So at this point, we don't have any partners, saying a firm commitment we're going to use this blueprint. But we are in discussions with several of our state partners about how does this information inform your implementation of your state wildlife action plan, and so I think that'll be kind of an organic process as we start to talk with each one of the states. They approach it a little differently, and so the products that we're putting out could be useful in different ways to different people.
Yeah, I think that all makes sense, and I mean, you're in Missouri, so I guess it's known as the show me state. So so I understand it's hard to develop context and get commitments when it's hard to understand what the products might look like. And and as you develop these products, you translate them into something that programs and agencies might find beneficial for decision making for implementation, then that context kind of gets developed throughout. So
yeah, I agree. We'll have to produce some focal areas for the LCC, but at the same time, I think that will be useful for a limited, things like attracting money at the LCC scale. I think what's going to be most valuable to our partners are a lot of the individual data sets that we've developed to pull together into that ecological integrity and the species information that we'll have to develop. And, at some point, it's going to just be a huge toolbox, and folks can go in and pull the different tools that they need to answer their specific questions. And so we'll have to do a lot of work to help them figure out how to do that.
Are there any other callers on the line that have a question for Todd?
Well, this is Mark Howery in Oklahoma, and I don't have a question. I just had a comment. I just wanted to thank Todd for walking us through this so eloquently and so in such an organized fashion, because it is, I hate to overuse the word organic process, but it was kind of an organic process early on. I was involved with the pilot study of the Ozarks, and Todd, you did a really good job of explaining how the process works, and at least the part of it that applies to the pilot study, and it's moved well beyond that. And I just wanted to thank you for that, acknowledge that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark. I present this as if it's, kind of a stepwise process, but that's really not at all how it happened. We were doing this part over here and this part over here, and it's been kind of, putting together a jigsaw puzzle and figuring out how it fits.
Yeah, but you explained it as a stepwise process, and that's the important thing. It looks very stepwise. That's what it really was.
All right, last call for questions or comments. Hearing none, I'll just say thanks again, Todd, for presenting this. And I think the GCP LCC science team is going to be meeting here in Lafayette in a couple weeks, and we're going to be talking about our own design efforts and how those fit in with CCAS and other things, and of course have some discussion about how what we're doing fits in with what others adjacent to us are doing. So I really want to thank you for providing us that context, and I know some of our science team members were unable to join the webinar, but like I said, we record this and they'll have access to view it ahead of time so that those discussions are fruitful. So I would just invite everyone who has any further questions for Todd, just email him or look at the GCPO LCC website, and you can get some contact information from them there. So thanks again, Todd.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm always available for questions. And I like this kind of stuff, so I'd always be available for conversations about it. And I think we've got stuff to learn from you all, and hopefully we can give you some ideas as well.
Well, we look forward to engaging you and the GCPO on how we stitch our stuff together across boundaries, because that's a discussion that I think many LCCs need to have. And we're
looking forward to it.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. This concludes our webinar for today, and we will have one on the first Wednesday of June. I think it's June 1st, and we'll put an announcement out in a few weeks about that. So take care.